There's a moment that changes everything for a man, and most never see it coming. It doesn't arrive with a fight or a dramatic goodbye. It happens silently. One ordinary day, he tries to explain himself and suddenly realizes something inside him has gone quiet. Not angry, not frustrated, just absent. And from that moment forward, nothing is ever the same. Most men believe explaining themselves is a strength. They think if they just find the right words, people will finally understand. So they explain their boundaries, their exhaustion, why something hurt them, why they reacted that way, over and over until one day they just stop. Not because they ran out of words, but because they finally understood something those words were never meant to fix. Here's the truth nobody tells you early enough. When someone genuinely wants to understand you, very little explanation is needed. When they don't, no explanation will ever be enough. And once a man truly sees that difference, he never communicates the same way again. At first he tries harder. He thinks maybe he's not being clear enough, not patient enough, not articulate enough. So he becomes more accommodating. He starts explaining himself before anyone even asks. Why he's busy, why he needs space, why he didn't text back immediately. And without realizing it, he's teaching people something dangerous, that his inner world is up for negotiation. Then comes the shift. He notices that explaining doesn't create clarity, it creates leverage. The more he justifies himself, the more predictable he becomes. The more he speaks, the less his words carry weight. The more he reacts, the more others learn exactly how to move him. And that's when everything changes. He simply stops. Not loudly, not dramatically. He stops correcting misunderstandings that aren't honest misunderstandings. He stops defending choices that don't violate his values. He stops translating his boundaries into language designed to make others comfortable. Not out of resentment, but out of awareness. And what follows isn't chaos or loneliness. It's something far more unsettling to people who got used to his explanations. Clarity without commentary. Boundaries without debate. Presence without persuasion. And once this moment arrives, it doesn't reverse. Most men don't over-explain because they're weak. They do it because they were trained to. From childhood, you learn one unquestioned rule. If something goes wrong, explain yourself. Clarify your intent. Smooth things over. And early in life, this works. Explanations resolve conflict and earn approval. So a man absorbs a dangerous belief. If I explain myself well enough, everything will be okay. But in adult relationships, the rules quietly shift. Explanations stop being about understanding. They become about control. A man explains once to be fair, twice to be understood, 3 times to keep the peace. But by the 4th time, he's no longer clarifying. He's defending. And defense doesn't invite understanding, it invites evaluation. Each explanation places him in a lower position. Not because he's wrong, but because he's signaling that his internal state is open for negotiation. Silence becomes suspicious. Certainty becomes cold. Boundaries become harsh. So he adapts. He starts explaining before anyone even asks, not to communicate, but to prevent conflict. This is where the real damage happens. Because constant explanation trains a man to outsource his self-trust. Instead of asking, is this boundary reasonable? He asks, how do I phrase this so it's accepted? And slowly, he begins calibrating his entire life around other people's reactions instead of his own principles. Then one day, something breaks. Quietly, he realizes he's already explained this. clearly and calmly, and nothing changed. That's when the illusion dies. Not everyone misunderstands you. Some people understand perfectly and still don't care. That realization doesn't create anger. It creates withdrawal, strategic withdrawal. And that's where true transformation begins. When a man first stops explaining himself, it doesn't feel powerful. It feels wrong, unnatural, almost irresponsible. Because his whole life, silence was framed as failure. Silence meant giving up, not caring, avoiding accountability. So when he finally chooses not to explain, his nervous system reacts before his logic does. Here's what most men don't realize. Explaining isn't just communication, it's self-soothing. It reassures him that he's still good, still reasonable, still being fair. Silence removes that reassurance. And when that comfort disappears, anxiety rushes in. This is where most men collapse back into old patterns. They feel the tension and mistake it for danger. So they go back to explaining. They clarify one more time, soften the boundary, add more context, not because it's effective, but because it temporarily relieves the discomfort. And that's the trap. Explaining feels like relief even when it creates long-term damage. Silence feels like loss even when it creates long-term respect. Let me be clear. Silence doesn't feel powerful because power isn't loud. Power is still. And stillness is unfamiliar to men who were taught to earn acceptance through constant effort. When a man stops explaining, three things happen at once. First, the other person feels uncertainty. They're used to engagement, dialogue, negotiation. Silence disrupts that rhythm. They don't know where they stand anymore, and uncertainty makes people very uneasy. Second, the man feels exposed. Without words, he can't manage perceptions or steer emotions. All he has left is his boundary. And standing on a boundary without commentary feels naked at first. Third, and this is crucial, the power dynamic completely resets. Because whoever speaks more is usually the one trying to maintain the connection. And whoever can remain silent without anxiety is the one actually in control of it. Most men misinterpret this moment. They think if they don't explain, they'll lose everything. But notice something critical. They're not afraid of losing the relationship. They're afraid of losing approval. And approval is what explaining was really chasing all along. Not resolution, not harmony, just approval. Here's the shift that changes everything. When a man stops explaining, he's no longer negotiating his worth. He's observing. He's watching how people respond when they can't extract reassurance from him. And those responses reveal more than any conversation ever could. Some people escalate. They push harder, provoke, accuse him of being distant or cold. That tells him everything. They were never interested in understanding. They were invested in control. Others soften. They adjust. They respect the boundary without drama. That tells him something too. Respect was always possible. It just wasn't required before. This is why silence feels dangerous, because it removes the illusion. The illusion that your explanations were holding things together. The truth is harder to face. Your explanations were often just glue covering cracks that were already there. And here's what most men don't expect. When you stop explaining, you don't lose everyone. You lose access to the wrong dynamics. You lose conversations that were never going anywhere. You lose emotional negotiations that drained you. And what remains is quieter, but infinitely stronger. Silence doesn't end connection. It filters it. It forces people to engage with you as you actually are, not as someone constantly proving, justifying, or performing. There's a critical difference between silence and withdrawal that most men confuse. Withdrawal is emotional retreat. Silence is emotional control. Withdrawal comes from hurt. Silence comes from clarity. And until a man understands that distinction, he'll keep sabotaging himself every time tension appears. When a man stops explaining, he's not being passive. He's reclaiming his frame. Frame is the invisible structure that defines who reacts and who sets direction. The man who explains is responding to someone else's frame. The man who remains silent without agitation is holding his own. Here's what most men don't realize. People test silence the same way they test boundaries. Not consciously, but instinctively. They push, they escalate, they introduce emotion because they want to see if the silence is real, or if it will collapse under pressure. This is the moment where men usually fail. They mistake pressure for proof that silence was wrong. So they break. They explain again, soften the boundary, reassure. And the test is passed, but not by them. Because the moment you break silence under pressure, you teach a dangerous lesson. Push hard enough, and I'll explain myself. But when a man holds silence calmly, without resentment, something powerful happens. The pressure stops escalating. Not because the other person suddenly agrees, but because uncertainty has replaced control. They no longer know how to move him. And that's deeply unsettling. Understand this clearly. Anger is predictable. Defensiveness is predictable. Explaining is predictable. Silence is not. And unpredictability shifts power immediately. This is why emotionally mature Maneftin appear intimidating without even trying. Not because they dominate conversations, but because they don't rush to fill space. They don't rush to justify or reassure. They allow moments to breathe. And in those moments, people reveal themselves. Now, let me address something crucial. Silence is not manipulation. Manipulation is using silence to provoke anxiety intentionally. Authority is being silent because nothing needs to be said. One is strategic deception. The other is self-respect. And people can feel the difference instantly. When silence comes from self-respect, it has a specific quality. There's no tension in it, no bitterness, no need for reaction. It's grounded, and that groundedness communicates more than words ever could. Most men believe power comes from holding on, from fixing, from staying. They're taught that endurance equals strength. But that belief quietly destroys them. Real power doesn't come from how much a man can withstand. It comes from what he's willing to leave. The moment a man realizes he can walk away without emotional collapse, everything changes permanently. Not because he threatens to leave or announces it, but because his nervous system no longer depends on the outcome. And people sense that immediately. Control only works on people who fear loss. Silent treatment only works if silence scares you. Withdrawal only works if abandonment terrifies you. Ultimatums only work if you need approval to feel stable. Once a man is no longer governed by those fears, the tactics lose their power completely. This is why emotional restraint is so destabilizing to manipulative dynamics. Manipulation requires predictability, and restraint removes it. When a man over-explains, he reveals his fear. Fear of being misunderstood, of being disliked, of losing connection, and fear invites control. But when a man stops explaining and remains composed, something else is communicated. I'm not afraid of the outcome. And that message is louder than any argument. Here's the paradox most men struggle to accept. The less attached you are to keeping someone, the more seriously you're taken by them. Not because you're indifferent, but because you're self-contained. You don't need to persuade anyone to stay. You don't need to convince them of your worth. You don't need to negotiate your dignity. This is why calm detachment is often mistaken for coldness. People are used to men proving care through emotional labor. So when that labor stops, they feel the loss even though the man hasn't changed his values at all. Walking away doesn't mean disappearing without accountability. It means refusing to stay in situations where explanation replaces respect. It means understanding that access to you is conditional on mutual regard, not endurance. Here's what happens when a man finally accepts his ability to walk away. His reactions slow down. His voice steadies. His need to convince disappears. He no longer rushes to repair emotional ruptures that weren't caused by him. And because of that, his presence becomes grounded. People treat grounded men differently. They don't test them as often. They don't push as hard. They don't assume emotional availability without effort, because the man has demonstrated something rare. He values peace more than attachment. Even after a man understands all of this, there's one force that tries to pull him back. Not fear, guilt. Guilt is quiet. It whispers, "You're being unfair. You should explain. You owe them clarity." And because most men were trained to be emotionally responsible for outcomes, guilt works. This is where many men undo all their progress. They hold silence, maintain the boundary, then guilt appears. So they go back, explain one more time, soften it, reassure, not because it's needed, but because guilt is uncomfortable. Here's the truth most men never learn. Guilt is not morality. It's conditioning. Men are taught that being good means being accommodating, that being mature means being endlessly understanding. So when a man chooses himself, guilt labels it as wrongdoing. But self-respect isn't cruelty, and boundaries aren't punishment. This is the internal moment that decides everything. A man sits with his phone, types the explanation, reads it, and pauses, because he realizes something. He's not explaining to clarify. He's explaining to relieve his own discomfort, and that's the question that breaks guilt. Permanently, am I explaining because this will actually help, or because I can't tolerate their disappointment? If it's the second, silence isn't just justified, it's necessary. You are not obligated to explain yourself to people who repeatedly ignore your explanations. You are not responsible for managing emotions caused by your denied expectations. And you are not required to sacrifice your peace to prove you care. This is where emotional adulthood begins. When a man allows others to feel disappointed. When he allows misunderstanding to exist. When he allows relationships to end without rewriting history. Once guilt loses its authority, silence becomes clean, neutral, intentional. When a man no longer explains himself, his life doesn't become louder, it becomes quieter, not empty, but clear. He doesn't announce boundaries, he lives them. He doesn't correct every misunderstanding. He lets reality do the work. He doesn't rush to be understood. He trusts that those who matter will understand, and those who don't won't stay. Stopping explanations doesn't reduce connection. It refines it. The man who no longer explains communicates differently. When he speaks, it's brief, direct, grounded. No padding, no emotional insurance, no justification wrapped in politeness. And because his words aren't diluted by constant defense, people actually listen, not out of fear, but out of clarity. He no longer tries to control outcomes through language. He understands that respect isn't negotiated, it's observed. So instead of persuading, he watches how people respond to boundaries, how they handle disappointment, how they behave when reassurance isn't automatic. And those behaviors tell him everything he needs to know. This man doesn't withdraw from intimacy. He withdraws from chaos. There's a difference. He still cares, but he doesn't chase understanding. He still connects, but he doesn't perform emotional labor to keep peace. He still loves, but he no longer abandons himself to prove it. His relationships feel different now. Less intense, but more stable. Less dramatic, but more honest. There's space. And in that space, mutual respect either grows or the relationship ends naturally. No arguments, no final speeches, just alignment or the absence of it. This is why the man who stops explaining often looks different to others. Calmer, slower, harder to provoke. Not because he's suppressing emotion, but because he's no longer ruled by it. He understands something most men learn too late. Not every reaction deserves engagement. Not every emotion deserves management. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Some things resolve themselves when you stop interfering. And here's the quiet power of this shift. The man no longer explains because he no longer needs validation to feel secure. His worth isn't argued, it's embodied. He doesn't need to convince people he's strong. He doesn't need to prove he's reasonable. He doesn't need to demonstrate loyalty through endurance. He knows who he is, and that knowing changes everything. This man becomes selective with his energy. He invests where there's reciprocity. He steps back where there's resistance. He stays where there's respect. And because of that, his life becomes lighter. Not perfect, but honest. The moment men stop explaining themselves isn't a rebellion. It's a return. A return to self-trust, to grounded presence, to living without constant negotiation. And once that moment arrives, there is no going back. Because a man who understands the cost of over-explaining will never again give his power away, just to be understood. The men who really change don't do it by learning better words. They do it by learning when words are no longer necessary. The moment a man stops explaining himself isn't loud. It doesn't look like dominance or indifference or rebellion. It looks like peace. Because once he understands that respect doesn't come from persuasion, he stops negotiating his worth. Once he understands that clarity doesn't require approval, he stops performing emotional labor. Once he understands that silence isn't weakness, he stops filling space just to feel secure. This is the difference between reacting and leading, between chasing, understanding, and standing in alignment. The man who no longer explains isn't trying to win. He's no longer playing. He speaks when it matters. He disengages when it doesn't. He stays where there's respect, and he leaves when there isn't. Calmly, without spectacle, not because he doesn't care, but because he finally cares about the right things. And that's the shift most men never experience. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires letting go of something familiar, the need to be validated. Don't rush to explain this to anyone. Don't defend it. Don't announce it. Just apply it quietly, consistently. Stay calm. Stay observant. And remember, a man who no longer explains himself has already said everything that matters.